All right, well, welcome to my week 14 update, or week 13, excuse me. We're not quite to 14 yet. Um, Man, I tell you what, we're just these classes keep ratcheting up what we're learning. This is pretty amazing. In this week, in my interfaith class, we spent a lot of time talking about how to look for opportunities for cooperative action. How can we look for ways to bring groups together for a common good? So a couple of ideas that we're talking about. One is look for community concerns. What are things that are inside your community that you and people of other faiths could all agree on is an important thing to be addressed? Whether that's raising money, doing a food drive for like a nonprofit or something, helping the food bank out, dealing with crime, poverty rates, literacy, other things like that. What is something that your religious beliefs and other people's religious beliefs could come together to work on? That is a great way to encourage interfaith dialogue and understanding, is find a common thing that all faiths in the area will share an agreement that this is an important thing to deal with, and bring people together around that idea and start to coordinate efforts to say, we can disagree on other things, but we agree on this point, this needs to be addressed. And then you can bring them together to help out with that. By doing that, that's a great way to build connections between groups. By finding that shared commonality, basically, is going to be a great way to bring them all together. In fact, we talked about an idea in Magic Valley. So this is up in southern Idaho. There was a interfaith group that came together. It took some time. It was kind of informal at first, and it was just more of a dialogue, just an opportunity to talk about each other's faith and to understand better each other. And it eventually grew and got to the point where everybody felt comfortable talking about the things that they disagreed with each other. They started with, what do we agree on, and let's discuss our views and ideas on those things. And then eventually they got so close to each other, they felt safe talking about the things they disagreed with as well. And so they ended up going into, being part of public forums to share and encourage more activity in this way of bringing people together to talk. And so that was kind of a fun way to see a good example of interfaith dialogue happening. In my Mormonism and early American history class, oh man, this was probably one of the busiest lessons as far as studying that we've had. I had 2.5 hours of lecture, almost 3 hours, full hours of lecture to go through. That was just that. And then I had 4 chapters out of a book to read to be able to write my reports and things. So we got a lot to talk about on this one. Some fascinating stuff though. So this is getting into like the 1950s and 60s and 70s of more like American thought as well as LDS thought. So if you're familiar with the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you'll know that there was a member of the Quorum of the 12 that was a very ultra-conservative firebrand. That is Ezra Taft Benson. If you ever read books from the far right, even to this day, most of the time if it's an LDS far right book or report or article, most of the time they're going to quote from President Benson. He was a prophet later on, but during the 50s and 60s he was an apostle. And man, did he give some crazy talks. That was in the time when, for the LDS church, you didn't have your talk proofread ahead of time. You just kind of showed up and spoke about what you felt you want to talk about. President, or I should say at the time, Elder Benson, he wanted to talk about communism and the conservative right and things like that. So probably by far some of the most politically motivated general conference talks you'll ever read. They're not bad talks. I've read several of them actually, and you can find them if you look up Ezra Taft Benson general conference talks. You can find them. They're not bad to read actually, but he was very conservatively motivated, and that bothered some of the other apostles. There were some challenges. Hugh B. Brown and a couple other ones had some issues with him. Harold B. Lee and those guys there was a lot of competing talks going back and forth and debating these things. I think it was in the early 1970s, as President Benson became the prophet, he changed the kind of talks he gave, and they actually started to implement the policy of submit your talks ahead of time, and we'll review them and then approve them or tell you what you need to change or adjust about your talks. So since the early 1970s, General Conference talks have been more curated in a way. That's not quite the ideal word to use, but they've checked ahead. What are you going to talk about, and have gone that way. So really interesting that the change that Ezra Taft Benson made to General Conference. But anyways, as we look at politics in Utah, that's what we were talking about. So in the 1895 to 1928, that time period, just as we're getting into the 20th century, most Mormons would consider themselves to be Republican, which actually would, if you're thinking, oh yeah, that's great, Utah was pretty original Republican, you have to understand that the platforms that these parties believed on is different than today. So Republican in the 1890s was more of a Democrat. They, as far as like dealing with civil rights, encouraging more equality and those kinds of things. The Democratic Party at that time was more pro-slavery. So there's changes. These parties, the names stay the same, but what they believe in flip-flops every few decades. From 1930 to 1950, Utah ended up being more pro-Democrat, which again was more of encouraging civil rights, encouraging equality for people. So we see these platforms swap. 1950 to 1959, so this is again, Ezra Taft Benson is in there. The church, a lot of the church membership in Utah, they tend to vote more Republican. So they go more of that direction, which is more of a conservative right at that time. And there's a lot going on at this time. We have to realize that evangelicalism, we talked about that book, Jesus and John Wayne, a couple weeks ago. Evangelicalism had been coming together with conservatism for a couple of decades. And as they came together, they really, in the 1950s, really bonded and took off with Billy Graham was a big one that encouraged more of these ideas. And then it came into the 1960s, and that it just kept going. So Billy Graham was a huge proponent of not just good conservative, religious values, but conservatism. And he started to really bring this idea together of politics and religion, that we need politicians that follow the religious conservatism and bring that together. Now, in conjunction with this, you realize that while the conservative right is pushing for more using public policy to promote their religious views, we have to realize, like in 1962, the Supreme Court actually struck down prayer in school. They used to say, oh yeah, we're going to pray in school, we're going to do more, and there was the monkey trials in Tennessee, those things in the 50s and that era. And so conservatism had changed a little bit, but then secularism became a thing and started to grow and do more. The problem is at the same time that we see this idea of secularism wants equal rights as religious rights, we start to see a problem that happens, because at the same time we get the Cold War and we get communism from Russia. And communism was seen as atheistic. So in the late 50s, early 60s, as this started to take off, the idea of communism was lack of God, so therefore America needs to be pro-God. And so secularism was seen as atheism and secularism was kind of lumped into communism. You were anti-American if you were an atheist or a secularist, like a humanist or things. And then if you are Protestant or more Christian, then you are American. And so that was part of this dynamic that started to happen. And so the religious right started to push more through the 50s and 60s and to get themselves out there. And Ezra Taft Benson, from an LDS standpoint, was by far the most outspoken person in this movement. He was pushing hard for getting rid of communism, and realize Ezra Taft Benson. So while he was an apostle, he also, and before, he was Secretary of Agriculture in the United States government for a while. So he understood politics. He understood being in government. In fact, he tried to run as vice president a couple times, and David O. McKay, who was the prophet, said, "No, you can't run for that kind of a political office and be an an apostle. So we won't let that happen." So he stayed as an apostle and didn't do those things. Ezra Taft Benson was a huge proponent of an organization that was anti-communist, named the John Birch Society. Now, most people today, if you're familiar with the John Birch Society, would associate it not just with anti-communism, but a lot of stigmatism and problems that were in there. And in fact, Ezra Taft Benson got his son a job at BYU for the sole purpose of finding the communist, the professors at BYU who were pro-communist in their ideas or more kind of pro-liberal ideas, and report them to him so that because it's a church-owned organization, they could basically get all those people out. So they only wanted conservative professors, not liberal professors at BYU at the time. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on around those kinds of things with the John Birch Society. But Ezra Taft Benson was very pro John Birch Society. I believe firmly myself that if Ezra Taft Benson was the prophet today, he would absolutely be supporting Donald Trump 100%. Possibly both elections, the 2016 and this most recent one we've just had in 2024. Absolutely, no question, he would have been stumping for Trump in 2016. I don't know if he would have in 2024, but there's a good chance he would have. That's his 1950s and 60s. The church is going through a lot of changes at that same time as well. They're growing. The church is growing in huge expansions in actually Africa. Europe had some expansion. South America was growing like crazy. So we were getting to the point of almost having more growth outside of America than inside America for the church. And there's growing pains that go along with that. And one is every organization used to be able to set their own agendas for like lesson manuals and different things. So the Melchizedek priesthood did their own manual, the Aaronic priesthood did their own manual, the young women did their own manual, the primary did their own manual, the relief side did their own manual. And they realized that we're being ineffective in our efforts here. So they created a correlating council to basically unify them and consolidate some of these resources together so they weren't duplicating efforts. So they could come out with a core set of teachings to talk about and allow the groups to just modify it for their individual classes. So that was a big change that the church had at this time as well. So for politics, though, again, evangelicalism, Protestantism, they were all moving to more of a conservative value. So there was a bit of a division between secularism was more liberal and evangelicalism, Christianity was more conservative. And so the church, again, with Ezra Taft Benson and others, they followed suit in this same pattern about that same time. One of the other issues that came up a lot, and we talked about this quite a bit, was the Equal Rights Amendment. Around the same time, we have the sexual revolution in the 1960s, where it started to come out of, hey, women decided they wanted to have more say. They want to have more vote. They want to have more opportunities. In fact, it hadn't been that long since women actually had the right to vote given to them. So, but they wanted to do more. They recently got the right to vote, and they wanted to be more involved in education. They wanted to work outside the home. They wanted to do more that way. And the 1960s, the counterculture revolution, sexual revolution really gave an opportunity for that to happen. They wanted equality. A lot of women prior to the 1960s and during the 1960s, a lot of women were not given jobs because they were women. A lot of bosses were afraid of hiring a woman. One, because they'd been told for decades that women weren't as smart as men, and so they didn't want a sub quality candidate. But the other problem is what if this woman, if she's a single woman, what if she gets married? Is she going to quit and leave? And so I don't want to have that worry over me that she's going to quit and leave at any point. So I'm not going to hire women. Another issue was I don't want to hire women because what if she gets pregnant? Now she can't work. So that just puts me in a bind. And so I'm just going to hire a man instead. It's just simpler and easier. And so that was some of the logic they were using at the time. And so women lost a lot of opportunities just because they weren't a man. And so the Equal Rights Amendment was encouraged at the time to rectify that problem, to change things around so that women were more encouraged to do things. The women were more encouraged to be involved in education, to speak out, to have a stronger say in their family finances, and being seen as an equal with their husband in the family, not just being seen as that person that does all the cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids while the husband works and plays and does all his stuff. The women wanted to be equal, wanted to have more opportunities, have a stronger say in their future and more choice in their own opportunities. And because of that sexual revolution too, the idea of contraception and family planning started to come around, as well as abortion. Abortion was a little bit more 70s, but it still was a part of this to an extent. So as these issues were coming out, there again, we have Vietnam War, we have the Civil Rights Movement as well in the 1960s. Lots of stuff happening all over. Cold War with Russia. I mean, there was so much going on. It was wild. So religion and politics start to merge as we start to see candidates coming together. Lyndon Johnson was seen, actually, he was encouraged by Billy Graham to get baptized. Billy Graham realized Lyndon Johnson wasn't baptized. No, was it Lyndon Johnson? I'm going to have to look at my notes now. No, it was Eisenhower. No. That was a little bit later. Let me think. Where did my notes go on? Let's see. Billy Graham. Oh, it was Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower was running for president, and Billy Graham realized that he was not a baptized Christian. He was raised Presbyterian, but he didn't necessarily wasn't baptized, and so Billy Graham convinced Eisenhower to get baptized. So he said, I'm kind of busy right now at the presidential race, but once this is done, I'll get baptized. He won the election, and he got baptized, and you started incorporating more religious ideas into politics, into the political agendas and things. And so that started it off. And then, of course, Kennedy comes along, but Kennedy's Catholic. And so that became a big debate because most of America was Protestant. So can a Catholic be good at running the country, or would a Catholic be beholden to the Pope? If the Pope didn't like American policy, would the Pope tell Kennedy what to do and Kennedy would follow him because the Pope's his spiritual leader? That was a big debate, and that was a challenge that Kennedy had to overcome during his election time frame. And if you grew up during this time frame, feel free to add your comments and thoughts of what this was like going through these times yourself. I'd love to read your comments on that. So, Kennedy, of course, got elected and then assassinated, and Richard Nixon came along, and Richard Nixon was working with Billy Graham and others and speaking at evangelical conferences and meetings and revivals and things. So he got seen as that person as well, of having that opportunity to be religious, and so that really influenced things. Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., when he started speaking about civil rights, he spoke in churches. He wasn't necessarily trying to create a big movement. He knew there was stuff out there, and he just recently written his doctoral thesis when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus in Alabama. And so he had just got his doctorate degree, was in that process of finishing all that up when Rosa Parks did her thing. And so he kind of ended up becoming they're like, you've got the right ideas, you become the head of this movement. And that's how he became the head of this movement. It was more of a religious movement, but then he realized this needs to be bigger and kind of weaved politics and religion together. He kept Dr. King kept his distance from the politicians because he didn't want to see his buddy with him like Billy Graham had been doing. But that gave him the opportunities to push against the system and stuff. So he kind of took more of the Old Testament prophet type of approach and really did a lot. But as he got more into politics, he decided he didn't want to do as much with politics, especially after the Civil Rights Amendment got passed. And as they kept promoting more for like voting rights and other things, he kind of went back more towards, I want to focus on church. And that's when politics turned on him because he's telling the people in power, you're sinners and wrong. And so they kind of turned on him and didn't support him anymore. That was right before he was assassinated, which you can go visit. You can actually, the Lorraine Hotel where he was assassinated is in Memphis, Tennessee. I've been there. You can see it. It's the National Civil Rights Museum. There's a lovely lady named Jacqueline Smith that is living across the street. She was a resident there and was evicted when the city bought the place and turned it into a museum for Martin Luther King and the civil rights. And she thought that was bad. They kicked her out, so she just moved her. They literally carried her out, carried all of her furniture out, dropped off across the street from the Lorraine Hotel. And as far as I know, she's still there today. It's been about 20-something years, about 25 years since I was there, but she was still there. She was living across the street, basically homeless, protesting the National Civil Rights Museum. And yes, she is black, but a nice lady, really nice lady. I met her when I was in Memphis. So these are all the things that are happening at this time. And Ezra Taft Benson is speaking. A lot of changes. The church is deciding we need to retrench. We need to encourage people to be more religious, focus on things. And so they actually started to work more on helping people to think about God and their relationship with God and do more, which is interesting because in my research that I'm going to talk about here more in a minute, on my final paper, I'm doing the first article of faith, which is about our belief in God and Jesus and the Holy Ghost. And during the 1960s, that article of faith got used more in the 1960s decade than any other decade. And it was quite a bit. It was a substantial improvement of use. And so the church was really encouraging people to focus on understanding God, the nature of God, and your relationship with God at this time when communism and godlessness and secularism was rising and all these things were happening. So it was a crazy time. And that's about my camera, sorry. And that's what we talked about. All these things that were going on. It was quite the week of learning. That's like a 12-minute version of the 3 hours of lecture that I went through. Now, the book I had to read was a little different than what we had talked about in our lectures. This book, and I actually recommend this book. I think I've reviewed this once already. People of Paradox by Terrell Givens. If you want to understand Mormon culture, this is a great book. It is a really great book to think about what is Mormon culture like? What are some of the good points and bad points of Mormon culture? I will warn you, Terrell Givens' book is, he uses a lot of big words, so you might go a little slow through his book to just think through what he's talking about. It's very information dense book. It's a great book for like researchers and things, but it's for an average person, it's not a 6th grade level easy read type novel or something. It's a little thicker, but well worth reading and understanding. In that book, he talks about paradoxes. What are some of the paradoxes in the LDS church? One of the ones that I talked about in I had to write a little essay for the class. The one I wrote about was the idea of certainty in the church. He talks about in his book, it's chapter 2, that he talks a lot about this paradox, that our church has this interesting paradox because the LDS church has a theology that is quite all-encompassing. We don't just believe about God, we believe that he was a man and that we can become gods and he has a wife and Jesus is his son and we are his children as well. And like there's all this other angles and all these little tentacles and perspectives, not just there is God, there's so much more to it. And so the challenge is Joseph Smith encouraged study and learning. We should do the hard work of studying and understanding these paradoxes. Joseph Smith called them contraries, two of views that are seemingly opposing, but they help us to understand our deeper principles of the gospel. That's where we learn truth, is proving contraries, looking at opposing views and finding the truth inside them. And so it's a fascinating paradox that while we have a church that really encourages us to study and learn and look at different opinions and ideas and be intellectual, that we have a church that is one of the most top-down, hierarchical driven, just listen to the leadership, don't think independent churches in all of Christianity in America, especially during the 60s, 70s, and 80s in that time frame. So it's fascinating. That was one of those interesting paradoxes, that we ended up with a very top-down church. The doctrine comes from the top down. You don't question it. You just do what they say. You're absolutely certain about everything in the church, and there's no room for error there. But yet there's plenty of room for error. This is, to non-Mormons, Mormons come across as very egotistical and very prideful, because Mormons claim to know the truth. And it was interesting. Terrell Givens pointed out in this a really interesting point when he talked about testimony. In most evangelical churches, they talk about coming to know. Your conversion is coming to know you are a sinner, and that you need God's help, and you need to change yourself to be more the way God wants you to be. That is your conversion. Whereas in LDS philosophy, the conversion is getting a testimony of external things, like knowing that Joseph is a prophet, knowing that the Book of Mormon is true, and those things. So it's not so much about your personal relationship with Christ, it's about these external things. And I'm not saying that to say that's a bad thing, because when we believe in Joseph Smith, we believe in his understanding of Jesus and those things. So when we think about it, this is what came to my mind. If you think about testimony and relationship with God, imagine a bunch of concentric rings. Okay, right in the middle is God and Jesus Christ. Relationship with them is absolutely superior, important, most primal, important part of the gospel of Jesus Christ. No matter which discipline you subscribe to, it's that relationship with Christ that makes the ultimate difference in all of it. Then you have the next ring out, which is, how do you administer the gospel of Jesus Christ at scale to a global church? That's where a church comes in place. The church doesn't save us. The church facilitates us coming to Christ. In evangelicalism, that is fuzzy, okay, because the focus is on your relationship with Christ. How you get there is kind of up to you. Which church you join, that's fuzzy. We're willing to kind of overlook a lot of that, because it's just about focusing on Christ. So as long as you join a Christian church, as long as you believe in Christ, we don't care. Unless, of course, it's you join the Mormons and then we kind of don't like you anymore. That's it, just one of those little interesting quirks that happens. But that's how Christianity is. They focus on the Jesus in the middle, and they're fuzzy about the details of the administration of things on the outside. Whereas the LDS Church gets very clear on the organizational part, almost to a fault, where we spend so much time thinking about the organization, we forget that Jesus is the reason in the middle, and we need to stay focused on him. So that's the difference, basically. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, ask questions in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. But it was a fascinating book, absolutely fascinating book to read. And really, if you are a devout LDS person, Terrell Givens' book will give you a chance to look at your beliefs in the mirror and reflect on your ideas of religion a little bit more, and go, oh, maybe I believe this, I know it's true, I'm working, but I need to understand it better. Maybe I need to deepen my faith and understand my relationship with Christ better, things like that. It was a really good book. Absolutely recommend it. So let's jump to my graduate class. We did not have class this week because my professor was speaking at a conference. So he's a very sought-after speaker, and definitely a historian, Mormon studies, religious studies expert, super smart guy. And so he was speaking at a conference, and so we weren't able to have class. So this gave me a little bit of time to work on my final paper. So I wanted to kind of give you an update on this final paper a little bit. And again, put in the comments if you're interested in me, like once I get this paper done, sharing it with you. I'll be more than happy to do a video just about this final paper and what I found. It's been absolutely fascinating. So let me give you some background on this paper. I have been very interested in studying and understanding the articles of faith for a very long time. On my mission, which has been about 25 years ago, that's sad. It's My mission president challenged me to memorize the articles of faith. I could roughly say a couple of them, off the top of my head, but I don't think I could have just rattled all 13 off at that point. I remember as an 11-year-old, when you graduate primary, you had to memorize them and they'd quiz you on a couple of them to get out of primary. So I worked hard. I remember working hard to memorize them and really worried I wouldn't be able to get, especially number 13. So I really prayed they didn't give me number 13 because that's a long one. And I don't think they did, thankfully. But anyways, my mission president challenged me to memorize them, so I did. And I've kept that study of them to keep them fresh in my mind ever since then. And since I think about them so often, every Sunday I do something. He taught me an idea of how to help me memorize them that just takes a little bit of time every Sunday. And so I've been doing that for 25 years. I know I'm pretty good forward and backwards. I can recite them pretty well. But I can see them more now, like in the scriptures and in other things. I've started learning more about them. So I've always been fascinated with them. And so I actually wrote a paper. I was working on writing a research paper that was more of a proof that the Articles of Faith are not just a product of the 19th century, but actually legit, like they are prophetic. So unfortunately, because that's more of a psychology-based perspective of the Articles of Faith, I couldn't use that for this class. So I had to think of a historical perspective. And my professor we did some brainstorming. He gave me some ideas, and that's where we came across this idea of what's called a reception history. So how did people receive the Articles of Faith? How were they used and interpreted? And so that's why I've gone that direction. I have so much information on the Articles of Faith right now. It is astounding. I could probably write 16 research papers just on the data that I've got about the Articles of Faith. Absolutely astounding. So as a historian, we're taught to drill down, pick a spot and drill deep. Go deep into the subject, get down as deep as you can. So I just picked the first article of faith to really flesh out and write about. And just writing about how the Article of Faith number 1 was used in General Conference. I wrote about 9 pages, like within a couple days, just really quick. It came out really fast. It was amazing. I didn't think I'd ever get that much information on one article of faith. And I'm not even done exploring it, actually. So I was worried I was gonna have enough to get 16 pages in. Now I'm starting to worry that I'm going to go beyond the 20 pages for this report because there's just so much. So in this paper, I'm writing a little bit about the history of the Articles of Faith in general, how they were, when did they get adopted and taught. And then I'm going to spend a lot of time in the details of how did they use the Articles of Faith, specifically in this paper, Article of Faith number 1. How did the general authorities use Article of Faith number 1 in General Conference talks, starting about 1950, going up to the 2010s, basically. So up to about 2020, basically. How did they use it? What were the interpretations they gave of the Article of Faith number 1? What teachings were they trying to validate by referring it to with the Article of Faith number 1? As well as I did a quantitative analysis of the use of Article of Faith number 1. So I broke it down by decade, so 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, did that all the way up through the 2010s. How many times in each decade was Article of Faith number 1 referenced? And I put all that in place. So that was absolutely fascinating, an eye-opener to look at, because like I found, as I'd mentioned earlier, in the 1960s was one of the most utilized times for the Article of Faith number 1 in the history of the church, by quite a bit. In fact, let me pull up my chart here real quick, and I'll give you an idea. So the only time it was more was in the 2000s. It got used. Ark Faith number 1 was referenced more in the 2000s. But in 1960, it was used almost once per decade. So once a year, somebody talked about Ark Faith number 1, and it was huge. The year before 1950, it was only used 5 times in the whole decade. The 1940s, it was 6 times. 1930s wasn't even mentioned at all. 1920s, it got mentioned once. So you can see how it went from, it got mentioned once in a decade in 1920, 0 mentions in the decade of the 1930s, 6 mentions in 1940s, 5 mentions in 1950s, 9 mentions in the 1960s. In the 1970s, it went back down to 5. So it doubled, practically doubled, 1960s doubled the other times that it had been used. Again, with the exception of 2000s, which got used 12 times. That was the all-time high for the Article of Faith number 1. So why was that? Why was the 1960s so important to use Article of Faith number 1? Same with the 2000s. Those are the things that I'm researching more into and I'm fleshing out more in my paper on. So absolutely fun stuff. Like, how did they use this? I even searched through periodicals to see over this same time frame, how did average members use the Article of Faith number 1? So what does it mention when people, talked like letters to the editor? When they used it in some of their ideas, did they use it the same way the general authorities were using Article of Faith number 1? And then I did a survey, just a quick survey, this last general conference timeframe. I put it out on the internet. I had a link in some of my other videos on my channel here on YouTube. So thanks if you were able to get on and contribute to that research. Your comments might find their way into this research paper. I did just a quick informal survey of what did people think about the Articles of Faith today. And so that's kind of given me this a little bit more data of what is modern ideas, what are some historical membership ideas, as well as historical church leadership ideas of Article of Faith number 1. How is it used? Why was it used in that way? How did it all come together that way? So that's what my paper is on. And so I've been able to spend some more time working on digging in deeper to the 1960s and the 2000s to look at those trends. So if you want, I'll go through once the paper's fully written. I'll be more happy to do a video about the whole paper and go over my research on it as well if you're interested. Let me know in the comments if that sounds fun. If you're willing to want to get that nerdy into my research, then I'll be more than happy to share that. So that's the update for this week. It's been a heck of a week. I still do plan on doing an update next week as well, even though it's Thanksgiving next week. So stay tuned for that. I found out that I still have class next week. Teachers aren't taking it off. I'm still got a full load of homework. So in fact, I have another paper to write for my Mormonism class next week. So lots of stuff going on. So we'll see you next week as we continue. We're down to there's 2 or 3 more weeks left in the semester, and then we're done with the semester. And then out for winter break for a little bit for the holidays, and then we'll be back in January. Oh, in fact, I've got my schedule for I'll bring that up next week. This video is already long enough. Next week, I'll talk about my schedule for next semester, the 3 classes that I've got then, and we can talk more about that then. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate this. Let more people know about the channel, come to learn more information, more fun stuff. If you feel you want to donate, there's a link in all of our videos, all the videos that I've done, where you can donate. It's like a PayPal account, basically, just to say, hey, I love what you're doing. I'm going to support you in your efforts. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. I'm not a nonprofit or anything, so there's no tax deduction for donating. But if you feel like you want to support what I'm doing and encourage me to do more of this, then let me know. That'd be great. And we'll talk to you next week.